Stand up.
From a defabricated solar-powered garden shed in Rockland County, New York, USA, this is Stand Up with Pete Dominick. On today's episode, how to stay on good terms with your barber so your hair looks exactly like Jared Leto's. And now, the podcast host who has no worries for such things because he is balder than a sea lion, Pete Dominick.
Oh, he's back, everybody. Pete Code nailing the intro as always. Thank you very much, my friend. Welcome to today's episode of Stand Up. I've got two excellent guests joining me today. Former editor-in-chief of Salon.com. He's now a senior fellow over at fairvote.org, the author of a couple real good books about voting, democracy, gerrymandering, and he is always awesome. David Daley joins me on today's show. And before that, I've got another conversation with the always brilliant, hilarious, thoughtful, thought-provoking, no-nonsense Dr. Jason Johnson of Morgan State University and MSNBC. He was actually in hosting for Chris Hayes last night, and he's here with us today because we are a big deal. And by we, I mean those of you who are paid subscribers, members of our community. You know, standupwithpete.com, patreon.com/Pete Dominick right now. If you haven't gone, this is independent media. It only exists because of you, the subscriber. So sign up now if you haven't already. And thank you, by the way, to Kimberly Kelly, the great Kimberly Kelly, always joins us at the Hangouts. Dr. Mary Cox, who's been joining us at the Hangouts lately as well. Matt, I don't know how to say your last name, Matt, but I sure do appreciate your subscription. Matt Olajen, my friend Matthew Sheridan from high school. Matt, are you listening? Thank you very much, my very generous, good friend, old friend. Michael DePalma, Nick Fabrizio, of course, helped me build the shed, and so many more. I'll continue throwing those names out. I try to remember every day. Can't do it without you guys. All right, well, I've got, like I said, two great guests, and I want to recap a little bit of yesterday's news for you. So where should we begin? How about Jamie Raskin was just on fire again today at the Republicans' Accountability for Government Censorship Act hearing, the House Oversight Democrats. Here is Congressman Raskin yesterday. I thought this doesn't need too much explanation, and I thought you'd appreciate it. Here he is, the Maryland Democrat at Rep. Raskin, who's been on this show as well.
Nor have they asked for hearings about this obviously far more sweeping assault on journalistic free speech in America. Why not? If what we care about is private entities censoring private speech. They've also been silent about the shocking and Orwellian corporate censorship being practiced right now by the New York Post itself, the Fox News Corporation, Newsmax, and One America News. These outlets are refusing to inform their viewers and readers about the explosive and uncontradicted revelations in court that Fox executives and hosts like Tucker Carlson not only knew full well that Sidney Powell and Rudy Giuliani and Donald Trump were lying about their ridiculous 2020 election claims, but privately called them, quote, insane, absurd, shockingly reckless, and dangerous as hell. These are quotes. And yet still, they credited and they circulated these outlandish conspiracy theories on the air nonetheless, and they now participate in a careful conspiracy of silence about their own complicity with the big lie. They are even shockingly trying to replace the mass of indestructible evidence telling the actual history of what happened on January 6, 2021, when 150 of our police officers were wounded by violent insurrectionists and the vice president of the United States was chased out of the Capitol by a mob calling for his hanging, with a few minutes of scattershot lies, pot shots, and distortions. Mr. Chairman, there is no factual basis for this bill. At the hearing, the only evidence we found of federal officials actually trying to coerce Twitter involved Donald Trump, whose feelings got hurt when a celebrity responded to one of his attacks by tweeting that he was a PAB, an acronym that I will not spell out in the interest of decorum today. But Trump then got White House officials to call Twitter and demand that they remove her tweet and remove her account. Again, none of our GOP colleagues has uttered a peep of protest against this clear governmental effort to coerce a social media platform to censor a private person's speech.
There you go, a little Jamie Raskin tearing him up yesterday in the House Oversight Committee. And now let's go to the other big story yesterday is that the propagandist over there at Fox News, Tucker Carlson, started playing or talking about the tapes that he exclusively got from Republican Kevin McCarthy, which is also the height of corruption, ridiculous. And he, of course, denied the truth that we all saw and watched with our own eyes. And that was a big, big story yesterday. And so let's go over to CNN's Manu Raju. He's a great reporter. He's dogging Republican Senator from North Carolina, Tom Tillis, who was pretty pissed about Tucker Carlson and what he said. Here's that from the halls of the Senate.
What do you think of, Tucker Carlson got this security footage from Speaker McCarthy and really had to downplay January 6th, said it was, mostly peaceful chaos in his view, and said it was not an insurrection, said that Brian Sicknick's death was not related to January 6th. How do you feel about that?
I think it's bullshit. I was here. I was down there. And I saw maybe a few tourists, a few people who got caught up in things, but when you see police barricades breached, when you see police officers assaulted, all of that, or you had to be in close proximity to it, I just don't think it's helpful.
Now, here is the Senate Minority Leader. This is Mitch McConnell. The turtle himself is not happy that Fox is depicting the January 6th insurrection the way it is, as peaceful and nonviolent. Here he is.
The release of this footage. Was it a mistake by Speaker McCarthy to give access to Tucker Carlson of this security footage?
My concern is how it was depicted, which is a different issue. Clearly, the chief of the Capitol Police, in my view, correctly describes what most of us witnessed firsthand on January 6th. So that's my reaction to it. It was a mistake, in my view, for Fox News to depict this in a way that's completely at variance with what our chief law enforcement official here at the Capitol thinks.
And what does he think? Well, the Capitol Police Chief, Thomas Manger, denounced Tucker Carlson for airing a, quote, offensive and misleading portrayal of the January 6th insurrection, including a disturbing accusation that Officer Brian Sicknick's death had nothing to do with the riot. In an internal message to officers, Thomas Manger wrote that Carlson's program conveniently cherry-picked from the calmer moments of our 41,000 hours of video to incorrectly portray the violent attacks as mostly peaceful chaos, adding that Carlson's commentary fails to provide context about the chaos and violence that happened before or during these less tense moments. Kevin McCarthy granted Carlson access to more than 40,000 hours of Capitol security footage from January 6th, with he, of course, used in an attempt to downplay the violence and defend the pro-Trump mob. Mitch McConnell there and other Senate Republicans calling Carlson's portrayal of January 6th attack on the Capitol a mistake, to say the least. They don't want to get on Tucker Carlson's bad side, but sounds like they're being, at least in the Senate, pretty outspoken, because Joe Wilson in the House, he thanked him, as a matter of fact. He was appreciative to Tucker Carlson, and he actually said that on the House floor. Listen to this 27 seconds of douchebaggery.
Thank you, Tucker Carlson. Last night, with January 6th, Tucker Investigates, which Glenn Beck has correctly identified as every level has been lying about January 6th. End of quote. The truth has finally been revealed.
I mean, the guy was there. He was there. Glenn Beck and Tucker Carlson getting shout-outs on the House floor. Those two Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative journalists themselves. I'm kidding. They've never done any kind of investigative journalism. And finally, here is the Attorney General. This is Merrick Garland.
The January 6th investigation is the largest in the history of the department. On television last night, one program aired some video and characterized it as sightseeing by a bunch of people coming into the Capitol who revered it. You've seen some of that video. What's your reaction to that?
So I don't want to comment on any particular reports. I think all Americans saw what happened on January 6th, and most of us saw it as it was happening. It was a violent attack on a fundamental tenet of American democracy, that power is peacefully transferred from one administration to another. over 100 officers were assaulted on that day. 5 officers died. We have charged more than 1,000 people with their crimes on that day, and more than 500 have already been convicted. I think it's very clear what happened on January 6th.
All right. What else am I following? What else did I want to tell you? You hear about this? Anybody hear about this? Walgreens, the nation's second largest pharmacy chain, will not dispense abortion pills in 20 states, including some places where abortion is still legal and available. Last month, 20 Republican state attorneys general threatened Walgreens and other pharmacies with legal action if they dispensed mifepristone. Oh, I don't know how to pronounce it. Vicky, stop making fun of me. Let me see. Let's see how it's pronounced. How about this?
Mifepristone. Mifepristone.
Mifepristone. That's what I was trying to say. Anyway, the Biden administration called Republican efforts to dissuade pharmacies from distributing abortion pills, quote, dangerous and just unacceptable. Meanwhile, 5 women who were denied abortions under Texas law while facing medical crises are now suing the state. The first time that pregnant women have taken legal action against abortion bans. The women have been denied necessary and potentially life-saving health care because medical professionals throughout the state fear liability under Texas's abortion bans. The lawsuit, however, is not seeking to block Texas abortion bans outright, but instead asks the court to clarify that abortions can be performed when a physician makes a good faith judgment that the pregnant person has a physical emergent medical condition that poses a risk of death or a risk to their health. So there you go. Walgreens, you done F the hell up. No need to go into a Walgreens anymore. That's a terrible, terrible decision. Here is Senator Tina Smith calling BS on Walgreens.
Well, we have here Walgreens buckling under the political pressure of these attorneys general, conservative attorneys general representing conservative states, but states where abortion is still legal. And they are saying to Walgreens and other pharmacies around the country, no, you cannot follow the guidelines of the FDA, which says that it is safe and effective to receive medication abortion without making a separate trip to the doctor's office. So they're using political pressure in order to deny health care to people who need it. And that's ridiculous. And it's outrageous. And of course, as you're pointing out, Alicia, this is coming as we await the decision of this extreme Trump-appointed judge in Texas that is on the verge, we fear, of denying access to medication abortion, which would basically make roughly half of the legal abortions in this country unavailable to women.
All right, there you go, Senator Tina Smith, on this terrible, stupid, awful, dangerous issue that Walgreens has taken a stand on. Real weird. All right, well, that's all the news I've got for you on today's news segment. But I have 2 great guests that I think you're going to really like. Coming up, David Daley of Fair Vote is joining me for a wide-ranging conversation about ranked choice voting, gerrymandering, and more. I think you'll like that. I always learn a lot when I talk to him. And right now, I've got my good friend Jason Johnson of Morgan State University. Last night, he was hosting All In on MSNBC. I didn't even know that, and I turned it on, and there he was. Of course, he's such a big deal. But today he's taking a big step down to sit down with us here, and we're always very grateful when Dr. Jason Johnson joins us. You should follow him on Twitter. You should listen to his podcast, A Word, which you can find on the Slate Network, and I'm always happy when he joins me. Let's do it right now with my first guest on today's show, Dr. Jason Johnson. Opening with a real shot at our good friend Karen Madison. Let's do it.
Saying the age, but I will say I'm younger than Karen.
You're younger than Karen, but like, what is your hang up with age? Why won't you say publicly your age?
Oh, no, I have certain very vague, arbitrary barriers about things that I don't say in public. I don't say my age. Outside of my mom, and you're the only person who's ever sort of interacted with her, I never talk about my family. Not because there's anything to hide. I just have certain boundaries. So yeah, stuff like that I don't mention. But yes, I'm officially I'm closer to being a grown up next week.
How is your mom, and when can we talk again? That was
she is fantastic. She's fantastic. We were actually just texting this morning. She, of course, when she discovers neat Instagrams or TikToks, she sends them to me and says, "This reminds me of you," or "I think this is funny." And then actually it's funny, just a couple days ago, we were talking about, I read about this in the news and I'd forgotten about it. from like 1969 to 1972 or 73, there was, because somebody was like talking about the anniversary of it, there was a rent strike in public housing in Newark, New Jersey, across like hundreds of residents in public housing. And I was like, Mom, do you remember that? And she was like, yeah, we were part of the rent strike. You know, our buildings were filled with rats. They didn't repair the elevators. We had bad plumbing. And this was public housing. And a lot of it was sort of racial discrimination. A lot of it was class. And it was this sort of big unified effort to force the city and the federal government to treat Black people fairly. So she was telling me that she was a part of that, you know, when she was a teenager. And again, like my mom has all these like crazy, amazing stories about history of stuff that she did and participated in that I hadn't even heard about.
Yeah, I should just cut you out and make her a regular. When you talk to how often do you talk to your mom, and when do you talk to her? Like, do you
pretty regularly? Like I hear from my mother every day. Like she texts me every day, or we're in like family group chats every day. We probably speak once a week. I mean, you know, like most mothers, she would rather she'd rather we talk more often. You know, she talked to her mother every day before she passed. And so, but yeah, like I pretty much hear from my mom every day. And, you know, if I'm on the air, like, you know, sometimes I tell my parents if I'm on the air, other times, you know, because it's interesting, you know, the way my mother will watch me on television is a combination of sort of appreciation, admiration, and then just concern. Because she's like, I know you. And so she watches the whole time, gripping the table, wondering if I'm going to say the kinds of things that I say when I'm not on the air.
I feel like you haven't gotten in trouble in a long time.
You know, but I think it's just a mom thing. It's like watching your watching your kids at a piano recital.
Yeah, fair enough. Yeah.
You know.
Oh, I know.
So.
I get it. I get watching my own kids, my parents watching me for sure. I think I'll start calling your mom more. I would like her.
You should.
Point of view on things because she's a brilliant woman. Dr. Jerry Johnson. I'm looking it up. She was on channel episode. I don't know what I'm talking about. 173. It was one of the greatest episodes,
wasn't it?
Ever.
It was like 2019, wasn't it? It was like several years.
August 2020.
Okay.
Apparently. Yeah. Very, very fun conversation.
I will literally text her after this. Yeah, she still refers to it. She's like, I had so much fun.
What is she working on? What does she think about? Like, I wonder what, I'd love to, pick the brain.
My mother is always involved in a million different things. So a couple of weeks ago, you would love hearing this story because she's like regaled people with it. So she did one of those DNA tests. And unlike Lizzo, she did not find out that she was 100% that chick. She found out that she actually has, like, our family traces back to Sierra Leone, right? Or at least, you know, she traces back to Sierra Leone. And so there's a program where you can go back to Sierra Leone and get a passport and become a citizen. So my mother went to Sierra Leone for 3 weeks and traveled with a group of people and got a Sierra Leonean name, found out what particular ethnic group that she was from, got a passport. It was this whole amazing journey. Came back, talked to me about it. You know, we were communicating the whole time, you know, primarily through WhatsApp. And yeah, that's just what she did like just a couple of weeks ago. Like my mom was always traveling. She's volunteering all sorts of places. She used to be, I don't think she's doing it now, but she was a volunteer advocate for like children's court, for children who are sort of in abusive, dangerous home environments, and they need an advocate. Because my mother used to work with at-risk youth, even when she was a school teacher. Like, she's one of the busiest retired people that you'd ever. I mean, my mom's been retired for like 7 or 8 years.
I can't wait to talk to her. I'm gonna catch up with her. I'm really looking forward to it. Okay, so a lot of things I wanted to talk with you about outside of your checking in with Dr. Jerry Johnson, your mother. You were one of the first people I texted the other night, Saturday night, when Chris Rock was on. You didn't watch it the other night, but you have since watched it.
Yes. And
I'm going to go ahead and say that the reaction has been pretty split within the Black community. And then I would even a more subset between gender, I think. Women that I follow have really been very critical of Chris Rock. A lot of women that I respect a lot. And then, you know, then we could talk about like what comedians think about it, of course. I think this is the kind of conversation that you can have like different credibility of reactions to.
Yes. So I'm gonna say this up front. So when Pete texted me, there are two people who texted me. Pete texted me, and then, Teray, the writer and blogger and everything.
Yeah,
so,
I saw his reaction. Yeah.
And it was interesting because first off, I was out with friends. We were watching Creed. So, which was fun. Great movie. Great movie. Really enjoyed it. Glad it made a ton of cash. Michael B. Jordan was great.
Opening
Tessa Thompson
weekend?
was great. Yeah. It made like $58 million. Like, it was the best opening for a Creed movie. I really enjoyed it. Here's the thing. And you texted me something. I'm not going to repeat exactly what was said in text. This was between us. But you were like, there's a lot of different reactions. I think this comedy special, like most comedy specials, is a Rorschach test. It is a Rorschach test for where people happen to be, what they think about a particular comedian. And I have a very, very strong and visceral reaction to how some people are responding to it. Because to me, I think some of us in the public sphere are responding in ways that are exactly why people who don't work in media don't like people who work in media. Like, that's a lot of this.
Yeah.
That's a lot of this.
I hear you, but still, I think there's a lot of valid points to.
Are there, though?
I do think
Are
so.
there, though?
Listen, I have a rule about comedy. You can joke about anything. And right. I think I heard you say something about, listen, Chris Rock is not the principal of a high school. He's not the governor. He's not the president. He's not a politician. He's a comedian. His job is to make people laugh. I do think that what happened between him and Will Smith was something that the entire world had an opinion on and had a pretty good context over a year about what happened, the history and so on. Mm-hmm. And I mean, for one thing, I wanted to ask you and every other black person out there, he ends it with a mic drop where he says, my mother told me never to fight in front of white people. And I was shocked by that. I was like, you just fought in front of me. I've been watching you. You're fighting right now in front of probably a majority white audience with a black man.
Well, it was Baltimore. So here's the thing. And I think this is.
No, I mean, a majority white. Even in that theater, there's a lot of white people. And watching at home, there's a lot of white people. And he was doing that live in front of a lot of white people. And I was like, to me, to some extent, the whole fight between the two of those men was bad for black folks. It didn't help them.
Yeah. But this is the thing. I think there's a couple parts to this to unpack. Number one, it's like what bothers me, and this is why I was happy to talk to you, Pete, and I had a conversation with a couple other friends of mine who were stand-ups, like actual still in the street stand-ups, because I wanted to hear the opinion of experts, right? Like, I'm not a stand-up. I don't know Jack. I'm a consumer of comedy. I don't produce comedy. I don't write comedy one way or another. That comment at the end, it was a joke. It's what Chris Rock says. Some of it lands, some of it doesn't.
Yeah.
And this idea of don't fight in front of white people is a joke, because obviously everything you do is in the public eye. Everything you do is in front of white folks. I don't take most of what any stand-up comedian says literally. And I think that part of the issue here, and I think this is a very, very good example of this. Part of the issue here is people refusing, those of us in positions with microphones, right? Refusing to acknowledge the difference between I don't like this particular artist, or I don't find this particular comedian to be funny. And the reason for that is either I don't like them, right? Or because my tastes and my interests have changed.
Yeah. Sure.
And it's okay to say that my tastes have evolved. The problem is when people try to pretend that this is about the artist instead of them. No, I don't listen to certain kinds of music anymore. There's certain kinds of TV shows I don't like anymore. Don't pretend it's about the person. And the other part, and this is key, and this is where I can talk to Pete, but I got to be really careful about these sorts of things, is this is also a sort of, it's the problem that we have with any form of art, where we don't want to be honest about what it means in that particular moment and be honest about it in that context. So what do I mean by that? I hear a lot of people saying, Chris Rock has a history of misogyny. Chris Rock has a history of, this, that, the other. If you feel that way, that's fine. And like I said, then don't watch the show, right? Don't watch it. Like, I understand if it's not funny to you. There's lots of people I don't think are funny. There's lots of TV shows I don't think are funny. Don't watch it. What I think is kind of disingenuous is to watch it and then comment on it on something that you don't like. if you told me 35 years ago, hey, Jason, what's your opinion of Andrew Dice Clay? When I was in junior high, I didn't like Andrew Dice Clay. So I'm not going to go get an Andrew Dice Clay bootleg VHS from one of my cousins in New York so that I can tell everybody how much I don't like Andrew Dice Clay.
I did not like him either. My buddies all had the tapes and they listened in the back of the bus. I'll never forget. They were listening in the back of the school bus and they were laughing. And I loved comedy. Of course, I was listening to comedy. I was listening to Carlin at that point. And maybe that's why I didn't like Dice. But I was just like, I didn't like it. It did not do it for me. Anyway, go ahead.
Yeah. So it's, so it's okay to say something isn't funny. It's okay to say we don't like it.
Right.
But it's interesting when I hear people say, like, I don't like this and I don't like this and I don't like this. I'm like, okay, that's fine. It's fine. You don't have to, like I said, it's pay-per-view. You didn't have to pay for it. But when people talk about his respectability politics or they talk about his sexism or anything else like that, I'm not arguing with anybody about that. I have no argument. That's fine, right? It's comedy. It's art. But let's also remember that a lot of your faves can be equally problematic if you actually paid attention to it. Mm-hmm. Listen to some old Trevor Noah. Listen to Paul Mooney. Listen to Eddie Murphy. Okay. There's a lot of things that a lot of comedians said that are problematic, and you can show selective outrage about who you want to be offended by, because to be perfectly honest, all of this is framed by what people felt about what happened last year. Cat Williams is somebody who I hear black folks say all the time, I love Cat Williams. I can't stand Chris. I can't stand Jay, blah, 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 blah. In 5 years, are we going to be having a conversation about Cat Williams where they're like, he refers to his children by the N-word. He calls them little N-words. That's violence against children. How can we like Cat Williams? He has a whole comedy routine called It's Pimpin' Pimpin'. Pimpin' is sexual violence. How can we respect or appreciate a comedian who makes light of sexual violence? I'm not saying that anybody can't have that belief system, because you can make that argument. What I'm saying is, if we do that with every single comedian, then you very rarely can have comedy, or just choose not to consume it. But let's not pretend that every single person you like, I'm sure I just saw him a week ago. I love Roy Wood.
I think Ali he's Sadiq. One of the best, if not the best comedian working today.
Really, honestly, one of the best comedians working today. Yeah. I think most of his delivery is flawless. I think his storytelling, I think his beats and timing are flawless. Somebody somewhere right now on TikTok is finding a line that Roy Wood had. And here's the thing. Criticism is fine, but I don't need a freaking 4-day think piece on a comedy on a comedy special that you didn't like. Just don't like it.
I agree with everything you said, except for I only wanted to point to that last part, because that last part about Will Smith, that was the part that only part that I really found problematic. Mm-hmm. And I mean, we can talk about sexism. We could talk about the reactions of Ben Shapiro and Megyn Kelly, both liked it, and that seems problematic to me, and so on. And we could examine it all. I'll just say I was alone watching it because I had a hot Saturday night, and I laughed very hard alone like 5-6 times. So there were a lot of things I found really, really funny. And I'm a sucker for a "you're so black" joke. And when he did the Draymond Green thing and all that, like even the more, lower brow stuff to me was still pretty funny, most of it. I just do think that the commentary on all things between Will Smith and Chris Brown is to some extent a commentary on black culture.
Did Will Smith hit Chris Brown?
Did I say Chris Brown?
You just said Chris Brown. I was like, wow. I'm sure Chris Brown. I think black people are pretty universal on what we feel about Chris Brown. That one's not really under debate.
I was about to gonna maybe edit that out, but your joke is so funny. Chris Rock and Will Smith. I think that part of it, Jada. I just felt like that was the only part I really wanted to that I'm interested in the perspective of black folks. And as far as everything else you said about comedy and so on, I think you're almost right on. I agree with.
So here's the thing I'll say about Will and all of that stuff. And we talked about this. We talked about this last year.
Yeah.
I absolutely understand and respect a lot of different feelings about that because of what happened and how people felt. I remember where I was, the whole kit and caboodle. What I think is problematic, and I always thought this, I thought this last year and I thought it was now, is that it was an example, and against a Rorschach test, and it's an example of toxic masculinity and the idea that a man's honor, that a man's public image, that a man's integrity is so fragile and so weak that it must be perpetually defended, and that it must be defended with violence.
Yeah.
And that's what I thought was bad about what happened last year. And what bothered me is that if that exact same behavior was playing out amongst a bunch of 20-something poor Black people in New Orleans, it would be universally condemned. If that same behavior had played out, I think I said this last year, if 50 Cent had been on stage and was making fun of Tiny, and T.I. got up on stage and punched him, everybody would say, oh, my God, is this the Source Awards? Blah, 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 blah. We would all be complaining about it. So it's not okay just because it happens to be toxic masculinity performed by a Black person that we have deemed to be good, by a Black person, by a Black woman that we have deemed to be worthy of protection. That's what I thought was a problem about it. And that does not excuse Chris Rock's behavior. But what I'll also say is this. He is a comedian. He has a history of making these sorts of comments. If you don't like it, there were other ways that it could have been handled. And what I don't like also, and this is a key thing, this is why I love Pete, because I can say these things and it's not going to get chopped up. I don't like it when people sort of do a post hoc retroactive explanation for why something happened.
Right.
And what I mean by this, Pete, is you got all these people who are like, well, this has been building for years. Had there been beef with Will Smith and Chris Rock for years, if there was, then why weren't we talking about it before the Oscars?
Right.
If they had so much beef, then the conversation would have been like, whoa, this is Will Smith's big night and Chris Rock is hosting. Is he going to say something? Nobody was saying that because there was no long-term beef. Because Chris Rock was at Will Smith's house at a barbecue the night beforehand. Let's stop pretending that this was the result of years of animosity. Okay? That's the other part I don't like. You can say that Chris Rock is terrible, sexist, awful, misogynistic, angry, and jealous. I'm not going to argue. If you feel that way, if that's how you feel, okay, cool. Right? But don't pretend that Will Smith's behavior was in any way honorable. You can't tell me that you don't think that you can't tell me that Will Smith, that Chris Rock's behavior was toxic and somehow Will Smith was honorable and justifiable.
Right.
I can say everybody is terrible. What you're not going to do is pick and choose which Black people get to engage in toxic behavior based on whatever sort of class, race, or colorist opinion that you have.
I'm very happy to have heard from you on this. Something more important, believe it or not, that I wanted to ask you about is the Fox News Dominion lawsuit. You were on MSNBC last night.
Yeah.
You're sitting there with a United States Senator, Chris Murphy. Now you're slumming it here with me in the shed. And I'm very grateful. You opened with that segment. That story's not going away, and it shouldn't go away. Ari Melber opened with it. Over the weekend, there was an argument between Russell Brand and John Heilman of MSNBC about the equivalency between MSNBC and Fox News, and they're all the same, he said.
Right,
Russell Brand.
I mentioned that last night.
Yeah, and I've been pretty hung up on that. So I wanted to just get your take on where you think this story is and why, it's so important, including with some of these new anchors that have been named, Brett Baer, Martha McCallum. I mean, they have to be, at least their reputations amongst everybody else has to be pretty much destroyed at this point.
Yeah, I mean, here's the thing. None of it shocks me.
Right.
I mean, Pete, like, this is the part that's scary about where we are as a country, right? Like, this is the kind of stuff Sarah Kendzior talks about and other sort of smart people who I appreciate. If you just step back from what the hell is going on in this country right now for 5 seconds, we don't have to go 50 years in the future. Anybody else outside of America see this now. You had a former president who actively tried to rig the 2020 election. Remember, this is the guy who tried to shut down mail routes, right, with DeJoy at the post office. This is a guy who was basically saying, I'm not going to leave office no matter what happens. So you have a sitting president with authoritarian goals who tries to rig an election in his favor. He still loses somehow, some way. He still loses in the legitimate process, therefore uses a media outlet that he has been collaborating with the entire time to perpetuate a lie in order to foment an insurrection that he and members of Congress hoped would lead to an overthrow of the government. That's what happened. And that's what is happening. And now the very same conspirators, McCarthy and Boebert and Marjorie Taylor Greene and every single 140-something Republican who voted against certifying the 2020 election are now controlling the House, have access to national security information, and gave 41,000 hours of video evidence of an attempted coup to one of their collaborators on Fox News. And then you have a fake I don't know what Russell Brand is, getting on television and trying to say
he's a wizard, I think.
He's like, I don't know what he is.
He's a sorcerer, or some kind of a sorcerer or a fairy or something.
Some sort of Chris Angel cosplay that he's been engaging in for years under the masquerade of being a comedian.
Chris Angel. I think he has little wings. He's grown wings.
Something. I don't know what he does. But then you have some loudmouth blowhard who doesn't know the key issues, daring to say that a disagreement amongst anchors about the cures, causes, and effective prevention of a global pandemic is the same thing as an obvious top to bottom conspiracy at an entire news network to foment an insurrection. What the hell? It's not even close to the same thing.
Not even close.
He's like, well, yeah, we got to talk about ivermectin. Who cares? It is primarily a horse dewormer. And I want to add something to this because I think this is interesting also about COVID. You know, they had the COVID story a week ago about, the energy department says with low confidence that they think that, COVID came from a lab.
Right.
I think there was always a problem in some of our public discourse about discussing COVID because a lot of journalists and a lot of their editors, for good reason, were so dead set at not strengthening or backing any of the racism and the anti-intellectualism of Trump that anything Trump said, you automatically had to say, no, that's wrong. Trump was saying Jon Stewart talked about this. Trump was saying in this particular instance, something that most common sense people could argue, right? Even though he wasn't a common sense person, which is there's a very good chance that this probably came out of China. It doesn't mean that you blame Chinese people. It doesn't mean that it was intentional.
Right.
It doesn't mean that this was an act of war. It means viruses come from places.
It means they have these horrific wet markets. And these viruses have begun at those markets several times before, not lab leaks. And so the evidence would seem to indicate that's probably where it come from. But like I said, but everybody was so adamant about saying like, hey, we don't want to feed into Trump's racism. Here's the thing. I don't care. Ultimately, there have been millions of people across this country who have died, who have lost family members, chaotic disruption of supply chains and life and health. And we are forever changed by what happened with COVID. Finding out exactly how COVID started is less important than how we chose to deal with it or not deal with it after it happened. And that, to me, was part of the conversation that was sort of being overlooked throughout these last couple of years. And I'll also say this, for me, as somebody who still wears masks everywhere, who keeps pointing out that you still got 500 something people dying, on a weekly or daily or something else like that of COVID. You still have people getting sick. I know 4 people who have caught COVID within the last month. It's not over. And remember that every time you catch it, if you get it the second time, the consequences could be worse and worse for you as you get older. I don't think we've managed this particularly well. It's not the same thing as giving Trump a win. And I think that when you have the sort of Russell Brand, Joe Rogan, Aaron Rodgers sort of white guys who are like, hey, I'm not going to let the mainstream media tell me what's up, blah, blah, blah. They say these things because for them, it's convenient to say a pox on all sides. Right.
When in fact, we're talking about radically different.
It's so lazy, too. It's so
incredibly lazy.
Yeah.
Incredibly lazy. And offensive.
Well, before I let you go, anything about, you mentioned fascism, you mentioned Sarah Kendzior, you talked to Jason Stanley on MSNBC last night, and you guys were talking about Trump and CPAC, and I think it hasn't maybe got enough coverage, but Trump basically said, at CPAC, I am your retribution. And it was like just this amazing echo of authoritarian's past and what that means. Anything that you want to say about him or CPAC or the presidential campaign?
We have been, I cannot state this enough, and I will not stop saying it. We have been summarily and almost universally failed by the Department of Justice and our current administration in keeping our polity safe. And one of the things that I mentioned last night is you've got Jair Bolsonaro. Here's the thing, not to give you a long history of Brazil for people who don't know, but Bolsonaro, the current Lula, who is the current president of Brazil, right? He was very popular. Everybody knew in the last election, the previous one, that Lula was probably going to get elected. And Jair Bolsonaro used his influence in the state government to have Lula thrown in jail. So when Lula got thrown in jail, Bolsonaro was like, my main competition is out, right? There we go. Similar to Trump saying, like, jail Hillary Clinton. Okay. So Bolsonaro gets in office. Lula gets out of jail on his trumped up charges and then beats him. And Bolsonaro has been involved in so many human rights abuses, so many global economic and environmentally dastardly things. His son is connected to the assassination of a member of the sort of federal government there. OK, what happened to Bolsonaro after he got kicked out of office? He had to flee. Because in a functional democracy, even a semi-functional democracy, if you try to overthrow the government, you gotta run. You gotta run. Even if you didn't try and take over the government. You remember Mikhail Gorbachev 35, 40 years ago would say, hey, I can't stay here after Boris Yeltsin took over Russia. He moved to San Francisco.
He did?
Yeah, he moved to San Francisco. That's where I think he passed in San Francisco. Gorbachev, yeah. When Boris Yeltsin took over, I think it was like 90 or 91, Gorbachev had to move to San Francisco. And he was just like, yeah, it's just safer for me. And usually what happens when you have a nation's leader who is unpopular, if they don't kill you, like what happened to Ceausescu in Romania, or they don't bring in people to overthrow you, like what happened with Saddam Hussein, a lot of his people there weren't happy with him, then you at least have to flee. And it is so telling that at CPAC, you've got a man who is actively, I'm not saying tried to overthrow the government. Donald Trump is still trying to overthrow the government, still trying to do it. And he's chilling, hanging out in Florida. And that is a sign.
He's the leader of the party still.
Yes.
As well. It matters.
That is a sign of how compromised our government has become in holding people accountable. And that's what worries me about CPAC. And I've been to CPAC a couple of times. I used to go.
Me too.
I haven't been since like 2019. And I would go just to interact with people and everything else like that. But as the Republicans have moved from being a party to a personality cult and a front for a terrorist organization, there's no point in even going.
Yeah. How significant was Joe Biden and Selma talking voting rights?
Have any voting rights changed?
Well,
Did he make voting rights a key part of his 2022 midterm elections?
Yeah.
Is it easier for black people to vote in Georgia? Is there anybody who had an easier time voting in Texas in 2022 than they did in 2021? Did he jump up and down on Joe Manchin? Has he done a push for voting rights now? Has he gone to try to compromise with the 18 or so Republicans who got elected in the 2022 midterms who were in districts that he won? Has he put pressure on them to pass voting rights legislation? No. The answer to all those things is no. Between not being aggressive in the prosecution of people who actively want to overthrow our government, failing to get rid of DeJoy, and not doing what needs to be done about voting rights, it's almost as if these people in office are not interested in securing their chances to stay in office.
I'll ask you one more thing. You did this on MSNBC last night, too, and I got to ask about it. In Jackson, Mississippi, in St. Louis, and in Washington, D.C., black people are in charge of important places, from mayors and all those cities. And it would seem that in all those places, and I'm sure other places, there are white people that outrank them because they're in the state and not the city, or in the D.C.'s case, it's the federal government, the president apparently, vetoing D.C. Are you watching all those things? Is that narrative resonating, or am I?
It's not new. It's just gotten worse as these things ebb and flow. The idea that white-dominated state governments, regardless of if you're in the North or the South or the Midwest or the East, that white-dominated state governments are actively trying to undermine the power and the will of majority black or majority non-white cities is not new. We've seen this all the time. In Atlanta, a couple years ago, the city of Atlanta runs Atlanta Hartsfield Airport. Atlanta Hartsfield Airport is the busiest airport in America. It's the busiest airport in America. You would think it was LAX or DC or LaGuardia. No, Atlanta Hartsfield Airport is the busiest airport in America. It is the hub of Delta Airlines. It is run by the city of Atlanta. So it's a huge cash cow. It infuses the city with a lot of resources. And because it was launched by, I think it was Maynard Jackson, 35, 40 something years ago, it's a key crown, right? And it's a jewel in the crown of the city. And the state government has always been trying to take that airport back from that black city so that they can control them. So what you see happening in Jackson, Mississippi, what you see happening in Flint, what you see happening in St. Louis is part of an overall trend of saying, we don't like these cities when they are run by black people and reflect the will of black people. And Biden standing in the way of DC statehood is the same thing. There's no reason that DC shouldn't be a state. You literally have people who are paying taxes and have no representation. And also, if you were to turn DC into a state, guess what happens? It gives more electoral college votes and Senate seats, very likely to Democrats.
Right.
But again, I think that our current president is an institutionalist, and he cares way more about maintaining traditions and institutions than protecting this country in what is an existential crisis. He gives lip service to the fact that we're in an existential crisis. But I don't think he really acts on it. So when I'll say this specifically about Mayor Jones, Tashara Jones in St. Louis, you got to remember also, Mayor Jones came in office not in the direct aftermath of Ferguson. It was 4 or 5 years out because she just got elected in 2021, right? So it was 6-7 years after Ferguson happened. She came in as a smart reformer for police, which you got to do in a city like St. Louis. And here's the thing. The primary thing that she suggested was a civilian oversight board. Everybody's got those. Miami has a civilian oversight board. Chicago has a civilian oversight board. It's not even like the civilian oversight board has the power to fire police. They review police behavior and give recommendations to the city. So the fact that she was like, hey, we should have a civilian review board and there'll be representatives from every single ward in the city and there'll be representatives from the entire community and we get to oversee, what the police do and not just misconduct, but also, hey, maybe the cops need new cars or this, that, the other. And the cops sued her because they don't like the idea of a black person and certainly a black woman mayor having any control over them one way or another. And that's the problem. This is not radical. These aren't radical suggestions. For St. Louis saying, hey, maybe we should have the same kind of oversight as Miami or Chicago, cities that are 5 times the size of St. Louis, and people reject it and say, now we're going to snatch it out of your power. That's just racism.
Jason Johnson, go call your mother. Tell her to expect my call. Can't thank you enough.
I should put us on a group text.
Let's
Man,
go.
I appreciate this. Thank you for giving me the platform that you do on a regular basis. And to the world out there, I want to say thank you guys so much. I felt so welcomed in your hangout a couple of weeks ago. It was
awesome.
Totally random. Like I said, I was just hanging out at Karen's place and she's like, oh, we're in a chat. You should come and hang out.
So great.
So I had a great time. So
that was such a fun surprise. It was hilarious to see you there, and we were so happy to have you there. That was a lot of fun. We appreciate you very much, my friend. I'll talk to you soon. Thank you.
All right, later.
All right, there he goes, Dr. Jason Johnson. Go check him out right now. Go follow him on Twitter if you haven't already, and go listen to his podcast. So good. A Word at Slate. You can always see him on MSNBC, and he could be your professor if you get into Morgan State University. All right, that's Jason Johnson, and now it's time to get to my second guest of today's show, another brilliant political analyst. He's a senior fellow for Fair Vote, fairvote.org. He's the author of Rat Fucked, the true story behind the secret plan to steal America's democracy, which helped spark the recent drive to reform gerrymandering. His second book is Unrigged, how Americans are battling back to save democracy. He's working on a new book right now, he mentioned, and I'm always really happy to have the former editor of Salon.com joining me. He's on Twitter at David Daley 3. Let's do it right now with David Daley.
So, first of all, you were just on a panel, a conversation, where was this? I just saw it, on ranked choice voting. And I just wanted to review that real quick with you and what we saw, I think, in Alaska and where else we're seeing it and what you think, or around the world, and how you advocate for it, what it would change.
I think what happened in Alaska really is fascinating, right? Because you had a race with several candidates, and what you would have likely seen in a plurality system, if only one candidate with the most votes wins, is a field gets split, and then people have to do all this crazy calculus in their head, right? They have to be like, well, what do the polls say, and who do I want the most, and who do I want the least, and if I vote for the person who I want, am I really electing the person I don't want, and if the person who I don't want is in third place in the polls, do I have to vote for the person who I like second? And what ranked choice voting does is it gives you the power to put all those candidates in order. And you don't win a ranked choice voting election unless if you've got 50% of the vote, right? What elections ought to do? Can we determine who has the widest and deepest majority support? So at the end of the first round, if nobody crosses 50%, you have an instant runoff. And an instant runoff is a beautiful thing, better than a regular runoff, because most of the time voter turnout falls precipitously between the election day and the runoff. Sometimes you have, as a little as half the voters come back out. So if you can do it all at one point in time, you have one election, the candidate with the most votes and the deepest, widest, broadest support wins. And in Alaska, that turned out to be the Democrat, Mary Peltola, who defeated Sarah Palin.
How about it?
In that race, which is pretty wild, right? I mean, Sarah Palin might have been able to win that race with 40% of the vote, even though 60% of the state didn't want her anywhere near office. And because they used a system that forced somebody to get 50% of the vote, the most polarizing, least liked candidate didn't actually win. That's great for our politics.
And this would be the kind of thing that each state would vote on changing their system to?
Yes. I mean, you could certainly see, any number of national laws as well, but states really are the laboratories of democracy here. And if you look at a state like Maine, they're using RCV now for just about every election. And it's terrific because Maine has this history of independent politics, and they want to have the voice and the choice that comes with having more candidates. They just don't want the headache of seeing somebody with 34% being elected.
Right.
I mean, imagine if we use this for, party primaries, for open congressional seats, where the seat has been wired to elect a Democrat or a Republican in the fall. And so the winner is actually chosen in a low turnout August party primary with 12 candidates. And somebody wins that with 20% of the vote and then cruises into Congress. A lot of that really is what this Fair Vote report is about. It's about how fewer than 1 in 4 of us actually cast a vote for a winner in the U.S. House. So when Americans feel like they're not represented, they're right. The truth is we're not represented.
And you're talking about this report that Fair Vote put out, Dubious Democracy 2022. Fair Vote's report highlights the overwhelming lack of competition in U.S. House of Representatives elections. You guys ranked all 50 states on voter choice based on their performance on 5 submeasures: margin of victory, amount of landslide victories, voter turnout, voter consensus for winning candidates, and partisan skew. And you mentioned just now one of the details there. You said just a quarter, just 24% of voting age Americans voted for a winning House candidate, the lowest number since 2014. What else? That's a pretty important finding. What else did you find?
Right. There's 2 new reports that I would urge folks to take a look at on fairvote.org that our terrific colleagues there in the research team have put together. They get to do the work of crunching numbers, and I get to come on and do the fun stuff with you. But there's the Dubious Democracy report, as you mentioned, and there's a new report also on monopoly politics that takes a really close look at the 22 congressional elections, really. And what we find is that a dramatic increase in the number of elections won by just absolute landslides. So elections in districts that are just not competitive at all. In 84% of the congressional districts in 2022, 364 or 435 races, you had a winner by more than 10%. 67% of these districts, the winner won by 20%. The average margin of victory in this country, 28%.
Wow.
This is all dramatically up from 4 years ago. It is a sign that just there are fewer and fewer competitive districts in this country, that more and more districts, really the election that matters is that low turnout, the party primary in August, which is just a base-driven election. Craziest person wins with 20% of the vote, coasts into Congress. It's no way to conduct a democracy.
It's really fascinating, both these reports, fairvote.org, and you also, there's a grade, you give them grades, 1 to 50 on a voter voice ranking, and it's got several different measurements. I think I mentioned them, yeah. But it's really interesting to see how these states are ranked and how people's voices are to be heard. The top 5, Minnesota, Oregon, Colorado, Michigan are the top. Maine, New Hampshire, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Iowa, Montana. Those are the top 10 that get a grade A. The bottom 10 are 41, Idaho, Indiana, Arkansas, Texas, Oklahoma, Hawaii, Mississippi, West Virginia, Louisiana, and Tennessee. It would seem that that's more progressive states at the top and more conservative states at the bottom. Do I have that right?
It certainly looks that way.
Why is that?
It's a really good question. I mean, I think what you see in those states in the top 10, you see a number of Western states. You see places like Oregon and Colorado that have got, a tradition of the initiative and the referendum and vote by mail, and states that I think are a little bit more comfortable with election reform. States like Minnesota, where there's a long tradition of that kind of progressivism in their politics. States like Maine, which use ranked choice voting. I mean, I don't think anybody would confuse Maine as a coastal progressive state, but certainly their politics has really opened up with ranked choice voting. And then you look at some of these states on the bottom, you're looking at, Tennessee, Louisiana, West Virginia. In many states around the country, Americans live in democracy deserts, and the quality of your representation and the amount of voice that you have increasingly depends on which state you live in. It has become, as these democracy issues and have become so partisan, I think what we have seen, is a conflicting tension play out in so many state legislatures where, some states have tried to make access to the ballot easier and other states have tried to make it a whole lot harder.
Or easier for the people that are likely to vote for them and harder for the people who are less likely to vote for them, to be a little bit more specific, right? Because some of these states, it's really easy for their voters to vote for them, right? Republican conservative voters, because they turn out and they make it easy and the systems work for those people in those districts in those areas, and they know what they are and they're familiar with them, and they're not really changing the rules on them. But of course, in other places, they make it harder and harder to vote. And that's not new, is my understanding, in the history of this country.
I think it goes back to the Declaration of Independence and perhaps all men not being created equal. It goes back to who was allowed to vote in the Constitution and who was not. And then once you finally got the Reconstruction Amendments after the Civil War, still left women out of the picture. And by the election of 1876, Reconstruction was effectively over and Jim Crow rises in the South up until the Voting Rights Act of 1965 attempts to bring in some kind of multiracial democracy. And then you begin to see the litigation and the challenges to the Voting Rights Act, which started as soon as 1966, right? I mean, it only took 1 year until South Carolina said, we're good. We've got this all figured out here. Let us out. And, back then the Warren Court said, no, we don't think so. Mississippi responds to the passage of the Voting Rights Act in 1965. The state legislature passes a whole host of reforms in 1966 that make it almost impossible for the newly enfranchised black voters in that state to get to the polls and make their voices heard. And why did they think they could get away with this? Well, because they got away with it after Reconstruction, right? They got away with it after the Civil War. They pass all of those amendments, they ratify them, and then they immediately pass a new state constitution that effectively undoes all of it for the next 80 years. And so it took the Warren Court in 1969 in Allen versus State Board of Election to say, no, Section 5 preclearance means these laws cannot go into effect now that the Voting Rights Act is here without the federal government's okay. So they are null and void, and you can't do that. But folks have been trying to say that things have changed in the South for as long as there's been a South, and it just took John Roberts in the Shelby County decision to actually buy into that load of hokum.
I really appreciate that timeline of what you just went through. It's super valuable. It really is. And I think
it's too long. I'm sorry.
No, not at all. Because right when I thought you're kind of going to stop and fast forward to 2010 and the Shelby County case, I realized, well, I know there had been challenges. It's just that they didn't succeed, and so nothing really changed about voting rights in a negative way. And maybe I'm missing something that did. But in terms of the Voting Rights Act being attacked, I mean, it was always re-endorsed every how many years in the U.S. Senate, and the president, a Republican.
1972, 1982, 2006.
Every 10 years. Yeah. So, and then, of course, they changed the makeup of the court, and they challenged it, and they won. And Voting Rights Act, which was fought for by the civil rights movement, was started to come undone. And as soon as it came undone, states took advantage of it. And I mean, as soon as it, I forget the, and there's been so much research and so much reporting on it and the effect that it's had. And yet I guess it's still controversial among some people, but there's no doubt that's where we are at now. And I would imagine some of that, and maybe a lot of it, contributes to the two reports that you guys came out with. How so?
Sure. I mean, well, let me say first that these are, deeply nonpartisan reports. They are simply taking a look at what has happened in these districts. We've had Democratic gerrymanders in states. We've had Republican gerrymanders. We have, you see, Hawaii is in this list of the worst states, and that's an entirely Democratic state. You see North Carolina in the top 10 on the states given an A. So I don't think that this is necessarily a purely partisan issue, but certainly what we have seen from this court, I think, has helped turbocharge the kind of gerrymanders that we saw in this last election cycle. We redistrict every 10 years after the census. So the maps that we held congressional elections on in 2022 were brand new and the first maps of this cycle. And what the Supreme Court said back in Rucho versus Common Cause, the case out of North Carolina a few years ago, was that they were going to close the federal courts to these claims. It was no longer a justiciable issue. And so they effectively greenlit every state to be as crazy and aggressive as it wanted to be with the maps that we saw in this last cycle. And you saw Democrats in Illinois and Maryland move to maximize every seat that they could possibly get. You saw the same thing in New York. New York State's Supreme Court ultimately threw that map out. But then on the other side, you saw Republicans do it in Texas, in Georgia, in Florida, Tennessee, Indiana, Oklahoma, Utah, right? The list goes on. And so the number of seats that are not competitive at all dramatically increases. And you can pretty much call something like 385 of the 435 seats for 2024 right now, just by looking at the demographics of these districts. And again, it's no way to run a democracy.
There's really a lot in both of these reports, and there's a few more things I want to ask you about that aren't directly related to them. Is there anything else, other outcomes, other conclusions that you found? And Fair Vote's a nonpartisan organization.
Absolutely.
And I find your analysis nonpartisan as opposed to your political opinions, which I think you're open about. But I mean, like, when we're talking about voting and the rules, you're taking a nonpartisan look at what both parties or any responsible parties do, any states do in their election rules. I mean, I think that's fair to say, right? I mean, nothing you need to add to that.
No, thanks. Yeah, I think that's right. I think what we all want to see is majorities rule, and fair elections, and everybody has an equal chance to have their voice heard.
So, yeah, and everybody should check out the organization because that's what you guys do. I mean, I guess I'm asking you to state your mission statement at Fair Vote, but people should check it out, fairvote.org. Such an awesome organization that David works with, of course. But so anything else about either of these two that you want to add before I move on and ask you about a couple other things?
I think that they point towards the need for big picture structural reform. And I think we're probably in agreement on a lot of that. So much of the problem in this country is in our lack of representation. The problem is single member winner take all congressional districts. And until we really think about how we get out of this single member winner take all trap that makes gerrymandering so important, that allows whoever draws a map to choose winners and losers, we are going to be stuck in this place. And it's why I think we have to think really much bigger about redistricting as we approach the next cycle 10 years from now, that we should be thinking that we have a redistricting problem, but that we also have a districting problem, and that perhaps the answer is a more proportional system. And Fair Vote has a terrific plan on this that I think is the way to go. It's called the Fair Representation Act, which would transform Congress from single winner districts to larger multi-member districts, and you'd use ranked choice voting to elect members. And so you could suddenly see Republicans being elected from Massachusetts, Democrats from Oklahoma. You would actually see that it would be possible to elect candidates of color in something like 95% of all districts, whereas that simply is not the case at all now. It would just be transformative for our politics. And that kind of bigger, broader conversation, I think, is really something we ought to be having now.
Well, I'm glad to have it with you, and always happy that you're having it or in it, debating it. And I just think that it's interesting. We're at the beginning of this to a certain extent, but you're seeing ranked choice voting in how many states? Is it just in Alaska? No.
Certainly Maine and Alaska have been using it now. But what we are also seeing is that really it's one of the most popular and fastest growing nonpartisan political reforms in the country. You're seeing it across Utah. You see it in New York. You see it in Minnesota. You see it in California, Massachusetts. Red states, blue states, purple states.
Different elections, town, county, statewide elections is what you mean. They can elect to use that?
They certainly can. What we saw in 2020 was that a handful of states used ranked choice voting in their Democratic Party presidential primaries, because previously these maybe had been caucus states. And really that's how a caucus works, right? A caucus is really a ranked choice election. Because in Iowa, you have to have viability. And if nobody has viability, then you move on to your second choice. It's just that a caucus takes all day, and you have to drive across Iowa and stand in a gym for hours and hours, and then they get the count wrong, right? So if we were to actually use ranked choice voting in presidential primaries, you could suddenly have these 25-person tickets, but we all know who the top 5 we like the most are, and the 5 we like the least. It's pretty easy. It's intuitive. And if we were to use a system like this as we head toward 2024, in which, right, it's not inconceivable that there could be wide open primaries on both sides with 20 candidates, this would be a huge, huge help.
How does Europe like ranked choice voting?
I think it's proven very popular.
Yeah.
It's proven very popular internationally, but it's also very popular everywhere it's used here at home. I mean, Utah County adopted it for local races, and this is the home of Brigham Young, right? This is a red county, and they took a poll there after the first use, and 84% of voters liked it. 83% wanted to extend it to all other elections. So people, once they're given a little bit more choice, don't want to give it back. This is a tool that makes it so much more effective in expressing the fullness of your vote. I mean, think of all these poor people in 2020 who cast a ballot in a presidential primary for Amy Klobuchar or Pete Buttigieg on Super Tuesday, only to have them drop out on Saturday or Sunday, right? And they'd mailed in their vote a week earlier.
Yeah.
Oops, sorry, but you don't get any choice in the presidential primary this year. If you'd been able to mark a ranked choice ballot and that candidate drops out, you simply move on to your next choice. I mean, it's just so natural and obvious and easy that we ought to be doing this to protect and ensure that every voice gets heard.
What do you make of the DNC? Is that who does it? Changing their primary state schedules? Always Iowa, which might explain why they're on that list, high on their list, getting a good grade. I don't know if there's any correlation and where they lay in the presidential primary calendar. But what do you make of the changes that the Democrats, at least, are making? It's no longer Iowa for both parties, and Iowa loses big time in a lot of ways, really. But the country arguably gains, and certainly in a party as diverse as the Democratic Party. But now, let's be clear, you're going to have to win the black vote to win that first state. That doesn't make that much of a difference if you win the first state. But it's clear that's why they put South Carolina as kind of a respect towards, I would argue, the support that black folks have made and forever, really, but certainly in these last few. What do you make of it, the new calendar?
I think it's tremendous, right? I mean, effectively, we've allowed white rural voters in Iowa and New Hampshire to winnow the field for decades now. And those states aren't representative of the country. They certainly aren't representative of the Democratic Party. And it's long past time to broaden that. I mean, the kind of bounce that candidates win by coming out of New Hampshire and Iowa is really hard to replicate. And so allowing other states to move up, allowing states that come closer to actually reflecting and capturing the full diversity of the nation can only be a positive.
Should we dispense of all other commentators for the next, up until the presidential election right now in under 30 seconds by simply agreeing on the fact that it's going to be Joe Biden versus Donald Trump and Joe Biden will win in a landslide?
If we could just fast forward to that, I think I'd buy that.
You would. Pretty likely scenario, you think?
I mean, I think actuarial tables could have something to say with that on both sides.
I don't know what you mean by those. I don't know that word. I think it sounds like they're both very old and could at any moment have any kind of issue.
I think Donald Trump could pull an Elvis on Twitter any day of the week, right? And
what do you mean by that? Coming back and starting back up on Twitter?
Sure. I mean, I think it's possible, right? I mean, he's been invited back up on Twitter.
Yeah. But when you say pull an Elvis, you mean he hasn't been tweeting. He would come back on Twitter.
No, by pull an Elvis, I mean be sitting on his toilet.
Oh, sorry. Got it. Go ahead.
But I'm glad that you pulled that joke really right out of me.
I feel terrible that I couldn't be there for that. I apologize to you and the entire audience. I refuse to edit it out.
Yeah, sorry. I apologize to your editor, who's going to have to fix all this later.
I'm going to scream at him right now. So, but you're saying that either one of them, I interrupted you, outside of the fact that either of them could die. They really could. I mean, they're older. Anything could happen. Their health could see a serious decline. That's not that a highly unlikely scenario. Other than that,
there's both certainly the favorites. I mean, of course, the favorites at this time in 2016 were Jeb Bush. And we all saw where that got us. So I don't know what's going to happen. I find it difficult to believe that Mike Pence or Mike Pompeo or Nikki Haley has much of a constituency in the Republican Party, and I think the early polls have borne that out. It seems to me unlikely that anyone on the Democratic side will jump in and challenge the president. I mean, other than Marianne Williamson.
But you don't think she'll be able to mount a serious challenge?
I don't. But until the president announces, we don't really know what his intentions are, right? I mean, it's not inconceivable that he could still decide that he's going to throw this whole thing open. I don't think that's likely, but he certainly hasn't made it official yet.
It's very easy to say that if he did, he would go out on top and his record would be the greatest one-term president certainly in our lifetime. I'm not that much of a historian. I mean, he could write that. He could write that in history if he wanted, and he could hang out with his grandkids.
He most certainly could. He could wax the Corvette and go out doing what he said he would do, right? Which is build a bridge to the next generation of Democratic leaders. If he's going to do that, he ought to do that soon, so there can be a full-throated and robust, competition of ideas. Because I imagine that there would be, 20 candidates out there, and we would need the time to ensure that we had ranked choice voting in all these primaries, so that we could actually get the nominee with the widest and broadest support. But until he announces one way or the other, the field is frozen.
You haven't been paying day-to-day necessarily attention. I mean, I'm in here watching these oversight hearings over here because I find them entertaining. But my question is really, any surprises about how Republicans have conducted themselves in Congress, in the House specifically, from the fight over the speakership to what you've seen or heard about regarding, any of the committee's hearings?
I'm surprised that the Ethics Committee is actually going to take up Santos. I wasn't certain that they'd actually do that. But
he's doing them such harm. Certainly the New York Congress, the rest of the New York delegation.
Especially given that the majority is so slender and every seat matters.
Yeah,
I wasn't certain what they would try to do there. I think the map gets better for Republicans in 2024 because they're likely to rework Ohio and North Carolina between now and then at the least. So some of the seats the Democrats picked up there, I think they're likely to lose next time around. So Republicans probably, while they look like they have a 4 or 5 seat advantage in the House now, they probably go in with something a little bit larger next time. But no, I mean, certainly it looks as if the pound of flesh that they extracted in the speaker fight has worked, and it's pushed McCarthy right, and it's made him really beholden to the most extreme piece of the Republican caucus. And that's really the way that our politics are incentivized, right? And until we change the incentive structure, this is what we're going to get.
I appreciate all of your insight and all of the work at everybody at Fair Vote. Tell them we appreciate it. And please come back and talk to us very soon because it's been way too long. David Daley, everybody, thank you very much, my friend.
Always a pleasure. Thanks, Pete.
All right, David Daley, Fair Vote. Go get his books, follow him on Twitter, read his stuff, and support him. Let him know that you heard him here on the show on Twitter if you'd like, at David Daley 3. Of course, Dr. Jason Johnson, thank you very much. Odessa Son, my intern. As always, Pete Coe, the announcer and voiceover guy, and John Carroll, the great John Carroll, who wrote this song for us. That's it for today. Looking forward to talking to you again tomorrow, as I do each and every day. I hope you've signed up for a paid subscription. If you haven't, hey, go ahead, do it now. Write a review on Spotify and iTunes. Please tell your friends about the show, and I hope to see you at tomorrow night's Hangout. Yeah, it's Wednesday. You're listening. This dropped on Wednesday. All right, I don't know when you're listening, but let me know. Email standupwithpete@gmail.com. Talk to you tomorrow. Bye-bye.
Boy, you better stand up. Stand up. Well, there's a whole lot more of us who know us right. They'll keep right on ignoring us if we keep sitting tight. You got to open up the window to let in some light. You got to stand up. That's right. You got to rise up. You got to stand up. You got to stare the devil straight in the eye. You got to let him know it's his turn to go. See it clear in off of your butt, get down off of your fence. And even if it ain't a very friendly audience, well, they'll begin to listen when you start making sense. And you stand up, stand up. No need to point your rifle to defend your town. Just stand up, stand up. You know they can't deny you what you're laying down. Boy, you better stand up, stand up. Show your face of every color, yellow, black, red, and brown. She's the place where every lost child will finally be found. There's only one thing to do before we stand our ground, and that's stand up, stand up. Well, the founding fathers saw a land for all. They had to stand up, they had to stand up. They had a keen imagination for a crystal ball, drawing all the plans of a stand up. But all they had to go on was the time they were in, with other causes for laws, and since they weren't even sin, they knew that change was gonna come before the change could begin. They had to stand up. All right, they had to stand up. We got to stand up. We got to look the devil square in the eye. We gotta let him know it's his time to go, and make it clear when all we hear is a lie. Why you lying awake wondering where the money all went? It'll be the cost of freedom that'll go unspent. You can see him flee the scene of that experiment if you stand up. All right, we got to speak up, we got to reach up and raise your voice in every way you know how. Don't be toes up, you got to show up. Ain't no better time to do it but now. No need to pledge allegiance to no wanton tribe. Rise up, show obedience to the voice inside, and listen well and it'll tell you not to run and hide. It says stand up, stand up, got to stand up. Ooh, come on, just stand up. Everybody got to stand up in the darkest hour. Stand up, people got the power. Stand up. Come on, 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 come on. Stand